original essay on ripping up the old economics textbook. And Diane Coyle's blistering counter-polemic was soon the first and second most read things on our website, as was a follow-up article where we got a load of big names in economics and said, what single lesson does economics need to learn now? And so there was clearly an appetite. And then the Financial Times got in on the action, and myself and Chris were having a ding-dong over there about the state of economics. We then got a response from lots and lots of people who said, well, we didn't know what was really going on in economics. And so we had fantastic people like Wendy Carling come in and say, there's an unheralded revolution in the way economics is taught at universities. So there's a lot going on, and there's an extraordinary amount of passion. I mean, more passion, I'd say, about this than there is sometimes on, you know, whether we write about is Jeremy Corbyn ever going to get elected, or is the Middle East peace problem soluble. So I've been stunned to see it, and also really encouraged, which is why we thought it would be a good idea to convene an event like this and have as much of this out as possible in person. Why is it then that the stakes, that there is such interest? I think it's because the stakes are high compared to most academic subjects. This is one that really does, for good or for ill, really bear quite heavily on public policy. So I think a lot of people feel they've got a stake in it, and there's a lot of practitioners out there, of course, and I'm sure we've got many of them in the room, so we'll make sure we leave time for questions. But first, we've got a fabulous panel here. I'll introduce them in turn as they make their introductory remarks, then we'll maybe have a bit of argy-bargy between us, and we'll of course make sure that we've got a bit of time for some of the, I'm sure, expert people in the audience to get stuck in as well. So first up, I'm pleased to welcome Howard Reed, who spent 25 years as a mostly rather respectable economist, writing rather respectable articles about things like labour market economics, but is a man who reflected, and he says with some regret, that where he's got to is that economics needs to be ripped up so that we can start again. Howard, can you try and explain?
Thanks, Tom. Well, it's good that you mentioned 25 years, because I don't know if anybody saw the third series of Twin Peaks that aired last year, but Dale Cooper, played by Carl McLaughlin, spent 25 years in this kind of shadow world called the Black Lodge, and suddenly, well, eventually emerges out. But he's also his brain wiped, so he's kind of this kind of sort of idiot savant character. And so, in writing this in response to it, I've sometimes felt a little bit like that. But I'll give you a very potted summary of what I said in the paper, which is probably about the article's about 4,000 words, I think. But my disagreement is with the kind of core theory of mainstream neoclassical economics, rather than the empirical side. Although we can talk about the empirical side later, where I think there are also some problems, but they're not as severe. But on the core of neoclassical economic theory, the basic stuff that's taught to undergraduates and to master students, the same kind of thing, often with more maths in it, has severe problems in my view, and is not really fit for purpose. It assumes that individual agents are rational, self-interested, acting atomistically, and really views human beings as kind of these kind of isolated calculating machines, you know. Now, it's true that there's a lot of work that does relax those basic assumptions, things like imperfect competition, bounded rationality, kind of models where agents interact with each other, which is great, and it's good to see that. There's also various other kind of issues to do with tautologies, logical coherence, etc., which are difficult to go into in 7 minutes, but we can come back to them if you want. But the thing is, whilst there are good kind of additions to the basic theory, to me the analogy would be a bit like, you know, if you've got a dental analogy, if you've got a tooth in your mouth where the core is so rotten that it needs an extraction, if somebody comes along and puts a nice kind of gold bling crown on that tooth, it looks great, but you've still got toothache. This is the kind of, this is the analogy to the problem I think economics finds itself in. And the problem also is, in terms of the way policy is made, it's often the kind of simple caricature rather than the more sophisticated version of theory, that still drives a lot of policy making and kind of popular economic discourse. I mean, the FT, fortunately, is one of the better examples of economic discourse, but there's some very bad kind of economics writing out there. I mean, the core paragraph of what I write in the article is this. I think, for me, the most general problem with the neoclassical architecture is it airbrushes out the negative consequences of destructive behavioural mindset, selfish individualism. Indeed, it regards such behaviour not only as inevitable, but desirable. Whatever the purpose of its practitioners, many of whom are thoughtful people with progressive views. I mean, we're not going around saying here that economists are complete monsters or anything like that. But the work it does as ideology, under the cloak of a scientific rationalism, it smuggles in values that narrow the realm of the politically possible and entrench the powerful. And then I go on to talk about the whole project that was originally known as Thatcherism in the UK and Reaganomics in the US, but has now become more globally known as neoliberalism, which has been taking hold in developed and many developing countries over the last 40 years. Privatisation, contracting out, growing inequality, deregulation, crushing trade unions, etc. So this is a deeply worrying state of affairs to me, and I think economics bears some responsibility for it. There are other problems, such as the failure to forecast the financial crash, but we can come back to that. I think even if we hadn't had a financial crash, there'd still be huge problems with economics. That's not the central issue for me, anyway. So what do we need instead? Well, rather than economics, I propose a deconomics, which is D in two words. It's deconstructing the core of economic theory, and it's decontaminating the kind of dodgy assumptions and false premises that a lot of both economists and practitioners suffer from. And a few main points to what I think. I mean, deconstructing a new economics will be a big program, and there's no way around that, and it will take a long time. But I think certain principles that can guide us. First, we need to realise that there's no such thing as a value-free analysis of the economy, and political judgments, whether of left or right, are kind of baked into the way we do economics. It used to be, the discipline used to be called political economy in the 19th century, and I think that's actually a better term, in fact. We also need to base analysis about the analysis needs to be based around how human beings actually operate, rather than a kind of textbook sort of prototype model of how they might operate. We need to embrace the really important things like technological change, environmental sustainability need to be centre stage in the model. They shouldn't be bolt-ons to the model. They should be at its heart. And we need pluralism and working more constructively with other disciplines like sociology, political science, psychology and so forth, which is happening to some extent, but it needs to happen a lot more. Finally, in the last 2 minutes, I'll just talk about the reaction to the piece as it was when it was published in April. I've got quite a lot of feedback. Quite a lot from other radical economists who'd already identified that there was things wrong with economics, as you'd expect. Some from mainstream economists who kind of realised that the game was up but hadn't wanted to say so. And also a lot of positive feedback from people totally outside the discipline who perhaps weren't hidebound by the same assumptions and were able to see things in a more kind of objective way. I then got, that was one lot of response. The second lot of response was mainly from some mainstream economists who agreed there was a problem but thought I'd gone too far in saying rip it up. They wanted to kind of tweak and sort of evolve from where we are. The Rethinking Economics group is a good example of this, and I have some sympathy with that and I have some common ground with those people, but I'm just sceptical as to whether tweaking will be enough. We may need to actually dump some of what's there already to move on. And then thirdly, there were mainstream economists who were very critical. And they fell into the good, the bad and the ugly. The good response was, well, Chris was one of the best responses we had, and I actually agreed with a lot of what Chris was actually responding to an article by Tom in the FT, but Tom's article said quite a lot of the same things I did in Prospect, and that was a really good response. The bad was, well, bad is probably unfair, but I felt that Diane Coyle's piece was kind of very bad-tempered, made kind of personal attacks and misrepresented some of the things I was saying. Like she said, I'd said that neoclassical economics doesn't take technical change into account. Well, that's not what I said. It does take it into account, but it's not the centrepiece of theory. So I thought that was a rather unfair critique. And the ugly I won't talk about, because there were some responses that were kind of more negative than Diane, and they sort of brought out some of the worst of Twitter. If you look at my Twitter feed, you can see some of this stuff. But we can come back to it if we need to, but we probably don't. So that's it.
Thank you, Howard, very, very much indeed. As I say, the piece by Diane Coyle you mentioned ran within an hour, I think, of Howard's piece going live, but she wasn't able to write it in time for the print edition. However, one reason I had the confidence to put Howard as the cover story and make this argument about economics cover story is that we ran something else back in January, which had several authors who were economists who were saying that they felt that what economists did was being misrepresented, and amongst the authors of that was Professor Oriana Bandiera, who we're delighted to have with us now as well. And she is the professor at the LSE, a great expert on development and labour markets, and also the director of a research outfit called Stickard, which is one of the most significant research centres at the LSE. And you might guess where she's coming from, in the sense that she's been known to use the hashtag what economists really do. Oriana, great to have you here.
Thank you so much. So economists, they study the behavior of people and what drives people's behavior. And so the first question that you should ask me is, why am I here? You know, I have other things to do, like I have 2 little children that are the best thing that I can do. The reason I'm here is that if economics is depicted as a bunch of crazy mathematicians plotting against the good of the world and into concentration of power, the type of people that I will be teaching next year is not the type of people that I want to teach, right? If we describe economics like this, we're not going to get anybody interested in social justice applying to the LSE. We're not going to get anybody interested in development. We're only going to get people who want to concentrate power in the hands of the few, and they're going to be disappointed, or forecast financial crisis. They're going to be disappointed because that's not really what economists do. It's true, the neoclassical model has plenty of problems, to the point that the last Nobel Prize winner, Dick Taylor, spent all his life deconstructing it. And at the core of Dick Taylor theory is the irrational man. So to win a Nobel Prize, you don't win it for an article that you wrote yesterday or even last year. You win it for the work of a lifetime. So the last Nobel Prize winner worked exclusively on changing the assumptions of the neoclassical model. I don't think we can say that economists, who are the ones who assign the Nobel Prize, really believe that people are selfish, atomistic, and all the other things that we worry about, and wear bad shoes. I think in the latest Guardian attack on economists, we were described as people from another planet wearing brogues. I had to look up what brogues were. So because I'm an economist, I do data work. I analyze a lot of data, mostly to understand which policies can be effective at reducing poverty. And as economists, we run field experiments. Indeed, I want to show you some numbers because, well, I can't show them because we don't have a projector. But some colleagues put together all the articles written in the top 5 journals of economics in the last 48 years. This amounts, and you'll be horrified, to 500,000 pages, about 15,000 articles, about 7,000 authors. Okay, so there's a lot of economics knowledge. In the last 5 years, do you know what's the 2 most common words that pop up in the titles of this article? Is not rationality, is not equilibrium, is not neoliberalism, is not forecasting, is nothing to do with finance, is field experiment. Because that's what economists do. They go on the field and they experiment what works and what doesn't. Now, why is this important, besides from the fact that I want to teach nice people? This is important because the scientific method to understand the effect of policies is the greatest contribution that economists can give to society. We want to have a scientific method, and by that I don't mean abstract maths. There is kind of an aversion to mathematics, as if you're good in mathematics, you're kind of an alien that should be put aside. It's not mathematics, it's good statistics. Okay? They're 2 different concepts. And the reason why the scientific method is important is that we make an hypothesis which can or cannot be verified in the data. This is called a falsifiable hypothesis. The type of alternatives that are often offered instead of the economics, as is done in places like the LSE, UCL, and all the other good economics department, is non-falsifiable. It says things like, it's better to help the environment. We all agree with that. Can we test? Better in what sense? Okay? We test practical things like, if we open the door to immigration, will the native wages go up or down? Okay? They have a theory that says they will go up, a theory that says they will go down. If they go up, the first theory is right. If they go down, the second theory is right. Okay? So this is what's called scientific method. We make an hypothesis, we collect data to test that hypothesis. And that's why I think, and the main reason that I'm here, it's important for people to understand what economists do, because it's important for the public to have trust in economics, so that when a politician comes up and says, this is going to be the largest, this is recorded, this is going to be the largest increase in spending in education that we've had in the last 5 years, and the increase is given as a percentage of a wrong number, people will trust the economists that say, look, that's wrong. That's the wrong number that you're looking at. Okay? Or if a politician comes and says we should close the door to immigration because all these immigrants are going to lower wages, people are going to believe the economists that say, we've had 1 million studies done on this topic. There is no evidence whatsoever that migration lowers wages. And that is why it's important that there is trust in economics. And that's why I'm worried about these critiques. Not because I'm offended personally as an economist, but because I fear that politicians and policymakers can get away with making statements and justifying them by saying, don't listen to the economists, they're all weirdos who believe in people who are selfish and atomistic. And as you know, economics has failed because he has failed to do what he was never meant to do.
Fabulous, Oriana. Thank you very much indeed.
The mic is broken. Apologies.
Do you want these? Do you want them as well?
Should I do this one?
Yeah, I've always wanted. I'm going to stand up and sing at some point.
I'll try. Happily, I don't have to say very much because the next thing I want to do is welcome in. Is this working? Yep. No?
No, but we can hear you perfectly.
All right. I will do it because they're recording. So, hello. I'll next welcome in Kate Raworth, who's an economist who works in the Environment Institute at Oxford and is also the best-selling author of a book about rehumanising economics called Donut Economics. So, Kate, over to you.
Thank you. I agree with Oriana about the importance of data, so I want to start by collecting some data. So who in this room has ever studied economics, whether it's school or, yeah, of course, there's a lot of self-selection going on in coming to this room, so that's an unusually high. Who, keep your hand up if you've studied up to at least a master's level. And keep your hand up if you've done a PhD. Okay, so most people only do a bit of economics, and I want to argue, even in this room where there's a lot of self-selection going on, I want to argue that the most important course in economics is Economics 101, or let's call it an undergraduate degree, because most people study that and then go on to become an MP or a civil servant or a lawyer or a journalist or a doctor or a community activist and take the mindset that is taught at that level into the world. And this becomes the public narrative of economics that we understand, that we debate in boardrooms, in parliaments and in the media. So to me, Economics 101 matters a great deal. And I hugely respect the research that Oriana does, but I don't want to argue about what economists do. I'm passionate about what economists teach, because it creates the narrative that the public then understands, and it shapes all of our elections and democratic debates. And it's actually, Econ 101 goes back 70 years this year. I couldn't resist, since we couldn't have slides, I had to bring some of my favorite toys. I couldn't resist bringing this book. This is Samuelson's Economics. Oh, there are lots of people in the room who read this one. 70 years ago this year, 1948. Now, really interesting story. Samuelson was teaching at MIT. He was actually teaching engineering students, people, servicemen returning from the war who came back to MIT to study engineering, to rebuild America. They had to study a little bit of economics on the side. and they hated what they were being taught. So Samuelson's boss came and knocked on his door and he said, Paul, they hate economics. Nobody wants to do it. Please stop doing your research for a little while. Write a book. What you write will be good economics. Keep in what you want, leave out what you want. Yours is good economics. And Samuelson said, couldn't resist. And he wrote the classic. Indeed, it says on the front, it is difficult to exaggerate the worldwide impact of Mr. Samuelson's economics. He also said, my favorite quote, I don't care who writes a nation's laws or crafts its advanced treaties, so long as I can write its economics textbooks. The first lick is the privileged one, impinging on the beginner's tabula rasa at its most impressionable state. Yes, Paul Samuelson thought your mind was a blank slate and he was going to lick it. He did lick it. He licked all of our minds because the diagrams that Samuelson drew in this book still profoundly shape the way we think about economics today. And I often say, professors sometimes say, oh, come on, it's a straw man. And I say, okay, you show me the first diagram you teach. Show me the biggest diagram you have of the economy. Show me the shape of success. So let's start. The first diagram, what's the first diagram that anybody remembers learning in economics? Yeah, by the way, it's the same answer the world over. There's a huge jump there. We don't start with what is the living world in which we, and the nature of the scarce means that we're supposed to be economizing. We don't start with purpose. We start on day one with the market, as if to say, welcome to economics, the art of managing the household. The economy is the market, and we're going to draw the market as if it's in equilibrium. I think that's an extraordinary leap. And I think it's doing no justice at all to students who actually should start with talking about purpose. What is the economy for? Because if we don't know what it's for, we have no idea what success looks like. Second diagram, what's the biggest picture of the economy? It is the circular flow diagram that actually Samuelson drew it in his book because he wanted to make it easy for his engineering students. He actually drew it looking like a radiator system of pipes. I was so fond of it, I couldn't show you the diagram, so I got my plumber to make one for me. It's a pipe. Now, Irving Fisher actually made one of these hydraulic machines. Bill Phillips made one. It's called the Moniac. It's at LSE. It's a diagram that shows households and business with labor and capital flowing round. In return, you get wages and profit, and that money can be used for goods and services. You could add a few pipes of government spending, of banks and imports and exports, but it essentially looks like this. It is a closed, self-contained system. And what gets measured is income. Anything that's monetized gets measured.
He doesn't have a tap.
Actually, he does have a tap. He has a little pump. He has a charming pump for pumping in technological change. But the tap connects back, savings and investment, it connects. So it's a good point. I couldn't resist the tap. Because we need the tap, you see, because the economy isn't a self-contained system. The problem with Samuelson's diagram, which still is the biggest diagram taught today, it's still the basis of calculating GDP and national accounts, is that it says absolutely nothing about the living world. All the energy and materials and matter that pour daily into the economy and are spewed out as waste and pollutants. It says nothing of the unpaid caring work of parents, the cooking, washing, cleaning, sweeping, that goes into raising children, that gets that labour fresh and ready for work every day. And it says nothing of the commons, where people co-create goods and services they value, not through the market or the state, but as a community. And Elinor Ostrom, another Nobel Prize winner, has told us, and we would be crazy to ignore it, the commons are a powerful way of organising, especially in this century with the digital commons. Now, any economist would say to me, well, hang on, you mentioned the living world. Of course we know it matters. Of course economists know it matters. Damage to the living world? In my 4 years of studying economics at Oxford University, if I wanted to talk about climate change, air pollution, a hole in the ozone layer, biodiversity loss, soil degradation, I was offered 2 words, as all of you were too: environmental externalities. Well, that's because we started with the market and we started with the price mechanism. Things that are priced are central and internal, and therefore, by definition, anything that falls outside the price contract is an externality. George Lakoff, a cognitive linguist, or anybody who works in the world of framing would say, this is crazy. This should set off alarm bells. That if we're talking in the 21st century, knowing what we do about climate change and the breakdown of the living systems on which we depend, if we define in the sphere of economics that is so influential, the living world on which we depend, if we call it an externality, this is not going to go well. So we desperately need a new economics that begins placing the environment, the economy in society, in the living world. If this was medicine and this was blood flowing around our bodies, well, we would learn it from day one that it's contained within a living system that has a digestive tract, it takes inputs, outputs, it is a thermodynamic system. We cannot separate the economy from the living world on which we depend, because we destroy it as we are doing. Lastly, the shape of progress. I never go anywhere with that hose pipe, they're so handy. The shape of progress in economics is, of course, in macroeconomics, exponential growth curve, GDP, which is hoped for to increase, you know, be very nice, 3.5% annually, please. It's written as a deep assumption of expecting, demanding, and depending upon unending GDP growth in our financial system, in our political system, which is the basis of funding pensions and eradicating public debt, and indeed in the social system. We are assumed that a higher income leads to higher well-being. This shape is deeply embedded in thinking. And there's just one problem. Growth is a wonderful, healthy phase of life. But if you look to nature, who's been thriving for 3.8 billion years, nothing grows forever. Nature's growth curve is like this. Things grow, and then they grow up and they mature. And why would we believe that our economic systems would be the one system that would succeed by bucking this trend? For all those people in the room who put their hand up that they'd ever studied economics, who here was invited in the course of all the economics that you studied to contemplate an economy that would grow but then come to a maturity point? One person, fantastic. But this is pretty rare. And I believe it is the existential economic question of this century, but it is so challenging to the fundamental assumptions of mainstream economics, it is barely touched. So let me end with a quote from John Maynard Keynes, 1936. Keynes said, "Economics is the science of thinking in terms of models, joined to the art of choosing models that are relevant to the contemporary world." I believe if Keynes were alive, if Samuelson, Hayek, Smith, Marx, you name them, if they were alive, the greats of economics, alive today, and if they knew what we know about the degradation of our living planet, they would be the first to roll up their sleeves and they'd say, "What? You're still using models I drew 70 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago? Do you have no ideas of your own?" They would be the first to pressure us to rewrite the fundamental models of economics, and I believe today's students absolutely have a right to be taught models that will set them up to deal well with the challenges that they already know lie ahead this century. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate. And let's hear finally from Chris Giles, who's moved from a career in number crunching and economic research to become one of the country's most distinguished economics writers as economics editor at the Financial Times. Chris.
Thank you very much, Tom. I'm going to tell you a very quick story, first of all, about going up to hear my first economics. Actually, it was a drinks party at Cambridge, almost exactly 30 years ago in October this year. And I was told two things by two different economics teachers at the time on my first day there in Jesus College, Cambridge. One was, forget all this stuff you were taught in A-level doing economics. This is actually totally opposite to what Kate has said, because of course the first thing you get taught in A-level is that economics is the allocation of scarce resources with constraints. That's literally the first thing you get taught. And wonderful professor said, forget all of that. The definition of economics is it's a study of how the world works and how to make it a better place. That stayed with me a very long time. I think that's entirely correct. That embodies both the positive aspect of economic study, how the world works, trying to understand how things really are, and the normative aspects, how to make it better for society as a whole. And that's obviously a difficult political question. And the second thing at that first same drinks party, a different professor said to me was, he saw me smoking. He said, "You're clearly not a statistician, are you?" And since then, I've actually done a lot of stats, so they're quite basic ones, and I do understand the harm of what I was doing at the time. Now, of course, economics always needs to develop. Subjects must develop. It's not just true of economics. It's true of any sort of discipline. But I think economics generally has been, this is where I would differ, I have no objection whatsoever to the first chart you see being supply and demand. I think that's a great chart. It explains lots of things that people don't understand. But it's absolutely not a perfect chart, and it's a very partial understanding, and as you develop, you will learn more things about where it's successful, where it works, where it doesn't, and how to manipulate it so you get a better outcome for society. And that is exactly what you would expect in any sort of discipline. I do think that there are some areas of concern I have, particularly about where I'd agree with Kate, is about teaching in economics over the last 30 years or so, that it's can be too mathematical, particularly at the early end. It can be quite trivial that you're just learning how to manipulate models in a mathematical form, and it's not interdisciplinary enough. You're not forced to do history of economic thought generally in universities these days. So I think all of those things are quite fair critiques. And a lot of them come from the incentives being wrong. So an economist could tell you why this is the case. And the case is because it's not in academics' interest quite often to have a different sort of course, because in fact it's not in academics' interest to do any teaching whatsoever, because they only get promotions under the Research Excellence Framework from publishing in US journals. Essentially, if you want to become a serious academic in this country, that's what matters to you, not teaching. And I find that rather depressing, or not having impact in the public debate either. So both of those things are not in there. But an economist can tell you that, because an economist would have looked at the incentives under the Research Excellence Framework and say, this is exactly what the likely outcome is going to be. Now, just what when we're talking about communication with the public, what are the sort of things that we really have to do in economics? And I'm just thinking, what do I spend a lot of my time doing, both internally, because a lot of the time in all jobs it isn't what can be seen externally. It's like telling people, no, you can't write that, we mustn't do that, this is really dumb, we shouldn't be reporting this. That's a very large part of my job. But when we are putting things out, the big things that I think people get wrong in economics are things like very, very basic concepts, which are often about measurement, and I don't think are particularly value-laden, like what is big and what is small. Is the fishing industry today a big part of the economy, or is it a small part of the economy? That's quite important to know whether you should have Michael Gove on the radio at 8:10 and give him 20 minutes. BBC didn't necessarily get that right, I would say, this morning. What is the difference between a level and a change? People confuse these things all the time. Look at the productivity debate. Britain's workers are a lot less productive at a level sense than a French worker, but that's not the productivity puzzle that we're trying to debate as a country. That is that we've become a lot less productive. The growth rate of productivity has changed, and that's a change in a change, actually. So that's the second derivative of output relative to time. We do spend a lot of time looking at aggregates versus distributions. What is the growth rate? Is the economy as a whole doing well or badly? What's the level of unemployment? Is that changing? And then there's a lot of reporting on who's doing well, who's doing badly. Is this fair in society? These are all questions to which economics has, at least, doesn't necessarily have good answers, but has a role to play in at least getting the facts out there in a clear and concise way. Myth busting. If everyone decides to save at the same time, it's a fallacy of competition. Keynes' fallacy of competition. If everyone decides to save, is this where it might be good on an individual basis to save, or we might say people are not saving enough for their own retirement or for the future or for the planet in terms of our resources? If everyone does that at the same time, does that then make everyone a lot poorer? So these sorts of myths. Is there a lump of labour fallacy? Does immigration? Is it just a supply thing? Does it lower wages? Or as Oriana was saying, well, there's no actual evidence for that, so there's obviously something else going on. These are sort of basic things that all come into the sort of how does the world work. And economics has a huge part to play, I think, in society in doing that, and can do it extremely well. Then there are issues like some of our measurements, which we get excited by, and I get particularly excited by GDP as a measure, because it creates news, and certainly will do next week when they measure it in a different way, and no one's going to understand exactly how it works on Tuesday next week. But is it a terrible measure of where the nation is? For the UK, I'm a huge defender of GDP. I know everything that's wrong with it. I don't disagree with anything Kate said. It's a crap measure if you look at it in lots of ways. But if you were a Martian and you came down to Britain in 2018 and all you had was the GDP figures, and you said, is this going to be a happy country or a bit of a divided, miserable country, and you have the trend over time, you'd say, oh, well, something happened about 10 years ago and we've not recovered from that, and maybe this country is not going to be particularly content with itself. You don't need any other statistic in the UK. That will do it, and you'll get it roughly right. You won't get it exactly right. You won't know what's really going on. There's lots of things behind the scenes you will not understand correctly. But as a broad brush measure, I think it's a very good thing, and we shouldn't sit here and denigrate it. So just to sum up, just one thing. What have I done this week? I've seen some great economics this week. On Monday, I was at a event for the Economic Statistics Centre of Excellence, where people were talking about ways of trying to get real-time measures of how different regions in the UK are performing, and using some very smart statistics to do this. And this will be coming out as experimental data at some point quite soon, and I think will be very, very useful. Something that people will find useful in trying to understand how Britain is working, and not just 3 years after the fact, which is where our current regional data exists. And yesterday I was at a trade conference, and there's some great OECD work where literally they've spent 2 or 3 years going through all of their member countries and finding out every single restriction there is to trade in services, so that they can put together an index of the restrictiveness of trade in services, all the laws that every country has, 88,000 different records they've got, and they were looking at what the difference was for intra-EU trade in services versus extra-EU trade. So you actually have a measure that you can then use to do some statistical work on saying, well, is this important? So we've literally, it hasn't even been published yet, so this is preliminary work, but they are at the point of having these measures, which will be fantastically useful and then can be used by researchers to see whether and to what extent, you've got all the different data there, so which bits of restrictions on services seem to matter for whatever you're interested in, because it doesn't have to just be growth, but what seems to matter and what doesn't seem to matter. These things are real work going on by real economists all the time. They're fantastically important, and I think if we were to say to get into where Howard wants to do, sort of slightly to rip it all up and start again, I think that the vast majority of economics doesn't need that. I think there are elements where, of course, you have to develop, but most of economics isn't doing that sort of stuff and is in quite a good state.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. I'll bring people in a minute, but there were just one or two things listening to those fabulous opening remarks. I just wanted to try one or two of you out on myself, if I might. One is, Howard, to see what you make of Oriana's point, which I'm sure is true for a lot of economics departments now, which is that people do spend their time doing these field experiments and so on. Do you, I mean, I'm sure Oriana will know, being in the LSE, do you think that engages with your article or not?
Well, that's a really interesting question, because a lot of the people responding to recent attacks on economics have been kind of empirical economists saying, we're working on X, Y, Z, and it's a very interesting area to work on, and we don't really have a lot of theoretical. We may start with a bit of theory, but really what we're kind of doing is applied statistical analysis for the most part, using very interesting new data sets. Now, I do a lot of applied economics myself, and I use a lot of data myself, and there have been huge advances in that side of the field. In fact, there's been a lot more advances in things like statistical estimation techniques than there has in the theory, actually, over the last 40 years, largely as a result of the availability of much more powerful computers, much more data. And to a large extent, I have no problem with that. In fact, it's a very welcome development. What I would say is that I think the weak spots in the core theory that I've identified are still there, regardless of the empirics. And what a lot of the empirics tends to do is sort of ignore a lot of the theory. But what we haven't had yet, which would have been interesting development, is if empirical economists were suddenly to sort of rise up and say, look, the theory is rubbish. We're going to kind of get rid of that and have a theoretical economics that is kind of more useful for what we do. And in a way, that's kind of what I'm calling for to a certain extent, I'd say.
And Oriana, would you like to respond to that at all? I mean, how concerned are you to defend economic theory as taught rather than what economists spend their time doing?
So economic theory as taught 30 years ago, I don't think I should defend. If I look, I have bright lights on my eyes, so I can't quite tell. But if I were to guess, I would guess that most people studied economics before 1995, before 2000, when Kate probably studied it, and when we were studying at Samuelson, literally. Things have changed. We teach at the LSE, we teach development. The environment, the fact that it is called an externality, does not mean, Kate, that it is external to economics. It means that firms, no, it doesn't. It means that firms do not pay the cost for the pollution that they create. That's why it is an externality, because it is external to the firm's balance sheet. That's all the externality means. It doesn't mean it's something out there that we don't care about. So I agree. 30 years ago, economics was what it was. It's changed. People seem not to notice. I want people to notice for the reasons that I said before, because I want economics to be taken seriously when we look at the numbers and when we hold politicians accountable for the numbers that they say.
One thing that was taught in economics going back to the 70s, and something Howard mentions in his article, is this thing called the theory of the second best, which means roughly that all the conclusions that people talk about in terms of equilibriums and everything balancing out very nicely, as soon as you move away from the perfect world, they don't hold. And Howard says in his piece that he thinks that most economists graduate and then never worry about this theory again. Is that something you ever worry about in your research or in your teaching?
Second best. We live in a second best world. Every economist knows. And the key thing about the second best world is that you cannot separate efficiency from equity. So anything that we look at in terms of efficiency has distributional implications. And most economists are aware of this. I hold the Atkinson chair, and Tony Atkinson studied inequality all his life. Inequality was an important topic in economics 30 years ago, as it is now. So,
thank you very much indeed. And then, Kate, I couldn't resist bringing you back in on Chris's point about GDP, because you're concerned to knock that down, and he's kind of defending it. It is true, isn't it, that when agencies like the UN have tried to find an alternative measure of well-being by factoring in health and education and other things, if you look at the rough ranking of the countries, it's not as different as you might expect. Sweden might suddenly look much better than the US, but it's not like Chad would suddenly emerge as number one. The rich and poor world still look quite similar if we had a different measure.
Actually, I'd like to go to Chris's Martian, because if that Martian, you give the Martian some statistics and he's looking at GDP, but of course, as we all know, Martians have biodiversity antennae on their heads. And so even though the Martian might be looking at a sheet that makes it look like, oh, this might be a happy country, it had a little dip, of course, their biodiversity antennae will make their faces fall and they'll say, my God, why are these people apparently so happy? Do they not know that their insect populations have collapsed about 75% in the last decade? That the ice sheets around them are melting? That their ecosystems on which their lives fundamentally depend are dying? Why are they still so happy, and why are they still looking at this one number? Now, if you bring that into these metrics. And actually, I think there's a huge resistance at the United Nations to take very seriously metrics like material footprints and put ecological metrics at the heart, because it deeply re-ranks countries. And I think it's extremely politically upsetting to what, I mean, I never use the word developed anymore and developing. I've never been to a developed country. This country is not developed. This country has a footprint so excessively beyond its national share of world resource uses. We are running down the living planet, not only that we depend upon, but all other countries depend upon. So this is not developed. We massively need to transition our energy systems and our use of Earth's resources. So even to me, that language is really problematic. And I think Martians wouldn't see developed countries either.
Reminds me of Gandhi's line, what do you think of Western civilization?
Yes.
I think it would be a very good idea. Yes. Chris, the one thing, actually, we've sat here and talked about economics for some time, and nobody's really talked very much about the thing that got lots of this conversation started, which was the failure to see the crash coming and all of that. It's a difficult thing to do, but is it good enough that a lot of economists say, well, don't ask me about, you know, the big picture economy because I'm a specialist in pension saving or whatever? Or do you think economists really should be able to answer that sort of question?
No, I don't think it's good enough. I think that's one of the things that irritates me, particularly about quite a lot of academic economists and quite a lot of micro as well, is that when it comes to the financial crisis, they sort of say, yeah, that was a failure of prediction. We don't do that. That was a failure of macro. We don't do that. And you think, well, what was the failure in the crisis? It was a failure in micro, actually. It was a failure to understand some of the microeconomic linkages in the US subprime housing sector and the microeconomic effects and incentives within investment banks that they were collating these loans and then selling them on, and they didn't have any skin in the game. So these were all micro incentive problems that got us into the conditions that created the financial crisis. So I am very much not, I get quite cross when people try and say, yeah, that wasn't my part of the discipline. That was something that economics as a whole got wrong. All parts of it didn't see it coming. Not everyone, because some people absolutely did. But there's been a hell of a lot of learning from that, both in understanding how financial markets work, in policy, in making sure that institutions are much better capitalized, have much bigger buffers, so that if these conditions occur again, we shouldn't get into the position which we were in October 2008, where nearly the whole of the banking system was just on the verge of breaking down and cash points were just about to be switched off. Those sorts of things really shouldn't happen, and I think that's where there's been a huge amount of learning. But to your point, yes, I think that but you look at all disciplines. You make mistakes and you learn from them. The fact that people die in hospital doesn't mean that medicine is a terrible discipline. It means that they try and do better next time, and that's what economics is trying to do and needs to keep doing.
Thank you very much. Let's take some questions. We'll try and take 3 at once, and please keep them short so we can get as many as possible. Woman there, first of all.
Hi, my name's Sarah Moore. I'm an economic historian. I did predict the economic crash in 2008. I'm supported by Professor Kapil of City University. My research indicates that Germany was much stronger than in the 1930s and than is popularly believed. I don't believe that economists have done enough research on the early 1930s or 1929, which was also slightly caused by we're all being on a single currency, and there was a bubble of money.
And can we have a question just so we can...
I want to have economists done enough research on the early 1930s.
Okay.
It's the 1931 and 1929.
Before the depths of the thing. Okay, got you, yes. Chap there, do we need mics, Oliver? Or yeah, if you want a mic, there's a mic there.
Okay, interesting discussion. I'm a member of the actuarial profession, and I'm personally involved in new economic thinking within the profession, which is why I'm here. We're very much questioning it now, but the big developments including the regulatory environment over the last perhaps 10 to 20 years, have been financial economics, which is all about theories of behavior and prices and what to do with trading, with virtually no useful purpose for long-term thinking. Would financial economics be amongst the things that Howard Reed would throw out? It would be for me.
Okay, fantastic. We'll try. Yeah, let's go to the back now. And
without the mic, to deliver sustainable development, should economists be taught to consider the market as an externality to the living world?
okay. Okay. Do you want to start on that one? That's up your street, I think.
Well, so I was fascinated, but Chris said on his first day at Jesus College, his professor said, forget all that about scarce resources. Economics is about how the world works. So then I really hope the first lectures you had was how the world works. And this is our planet, and here's the climate, and here's how the climate system works, and the hydrological system, and the nutrient flow system, and ecosystems, because this is the world. This is the living world on which we, part of nature, part of the living world, utterly depend for all of our well-being. And once we've learned that, now we can talk about the construct that humans make of institutions and markets and households within that living world. So I certainly would never start an economics course with supply and demand. I find it a bizarre place to start, as if it internalizes and centralizes market thought and pricing and contracts, which, and Oriana, I wasn't saying that externalities means it's external to the economy. It means it's external to the price contract, as if that is what we should place at the center of our thinking. We should place human well-being and understand that it depends upon meeting the needs of each person. Let's start with human rights. That's humanity's 70-year conversation about what human well-being is, embedded in a thriving living world. So I start there. I draw it as a donut, and I start there. And then ask what kind of institutions, whether it's markets or state or commons or the household, different forms of economic provisioning, what role for finance in service to this provisioning, what kind of economic design actually enables people to meet their needs and rights within the means of the planet. To me, that is 21st century economics.
Fabulous, thanks. Oriana, do you want to come in on this point about externality? Do you understand what the questioner might be getting at about having the market as an externality to the biosphere?
Yeah, why not? I think it's rather misleading to describe the way economists looks at the way the world works as ignoring the environment. Actually, misleading is a nice way of putting it. It's simply not true. So markets are where people meet to exchange goods. The production of goods has impacts on the environment, and so does the consumption of goods. So they have to be seen as one. I don't see why one is external to the other. I don't even imagine a ranking. They are part of the same thing.
Thank you very much. Indeed. Howard, one question very firmly directed towards you about whether we should jettison financial economics along with everything else. Yeah. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on the early 30s.
Yeah. Well, finance economics is a very interesting topic because it's not a lot of it is taught at undergraduate level unless you do the actual kind of finance economics kind of course. It's kind of rather walled off, and a lot of it is taught at things like business school. It's pretty mathematical, not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but it's kind of weird. There's been a lot of focus in the financial economics sub-discipline on kind of a certain definition of efficient market, but not much on things actually going on in the real world, like build-up of debt, which is looked at more now by economic researchers. But the build-up of debt in up to the 2008 crash wasn't looked at in a lot, and wasn't included in a lot of macro models even. Derivatives are kind of, the derivatives are analysed in sort of strict mathematical terms and other financial instruments, but the impact of derivatives on the wider economy is still not well understood. And there's also, I think there's a lack of a lack of analysis of some of the technological developments in finance, like ultra high frequency trading. There's a really good book called Dark Pool's Rise of the AI Traders by Scott somebody, unfortunately I've forgotten his name, but if you read this, you'll be absolutely horrified at the way that trades are taking place, you know, sometimes billions of times a second, and very, very thinly regulated, and often the regulators don't actually understand. Sometimes the people building the machines don't understand what's actually going on. I mean, this is the scary thing, you know, the whole thing is kind of out of control. It's more of a cybernetics thing than the economics thing in many ways.
Thank you. And so you would jettison it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Right, throw it on the bonfire with everything else. Chris, do you have any thoughts on either that? I mean, financial economics, I don't know where to start with. I don't know anything about it.
Not particularly. I just would agree with Howard in the sense that I think it's dangerous when we have elements of the way trading actually works which we don't understand, and we had a lot of that before the crisis, and we've potentially got quite a bit of it still now, and it's very important that regulators, because you know this is again where you get, I think you have to move miles away from this idea there's an economics 101 where these things are happening in free markets. Financial markets are extraordinarily tightly regulated, not necessarily very well, and that was the problem, but they are tightly regulated. The idea that these things happen in a vacuum, or in fact that almost any market trades happen in a vacuum in the terms of the free market approach, which I think is not actually taught in very many, I think is very, very rarely taught like that, but it is appropriated by some parts of the political spectrum. And that's why I'd always suggest going back to how things really work and understanding them and making sure regulators do, rather than sticking to very, very simplistic theories.
I mean, on the 30s, I would agree with the woman with the question that, like, I think it all gets lumped together much to, let's look back at the 30s and people just say, and it was all caused by a downturn in trade or something, whereas actually it was a complicated and long story, like our own story in our own times, over 4 or 5 years, and it's worth studying every bit of it separately. Let's try and get another 3 questions now, and this time we'll go to this side because we've neglected them up until now. Let's start at the front with you, sir.
Chris and Professor Ariana, do you disagree with Kate and Howard that Economics 101 is constraining the art of the politically possible?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you so much for having this debate. I think it's massively important, and a special thanks to the mainstream too for turning up. I've worked in government for about the last 12 years, and I think the influence of economic theory in government is absolutely pervasive. It's very clear to see how it influences decisions every single day. And I've been increasingly concerned that that influence is unhelpful. And it's not because it's too mathematical. In the words of Mariana Mazzucato, it's that it's using the wrong kind of maths. It's using the maths of Newtonian physics when it should be using the maths of biology. And I think, you know, I sympathize with everything that Howard and Kate have said, but I think it's helpful if we can be specific in our criticisms and our suggestions for change. And so I want to see if everyone on the panel agrees that equilibrium is an unhelpful framework for understanding growth, crashes, inequality, innovation, technological change, transformations in markets, almost anything that we actually care about and want to do something about. And so it would be much better to replace it with a theoretical framework, a mathematical modeling system that is based on complex adaptive systems, which is not hand-waving, it has theoretical foundations, it has maths, you can do stuff with it.
Okay.
Does everyone agree on that?
Okay. Right, and chap with the beard behind you, yeah.
First of all, I'm not an economist, I'm an artist and designer, so I strayed into this by accident some years ago. But it's fascinating. And there was apparently the housing crash, or the housing problems in America, were partly the result, as I understand it, of Clinton trying to do the right thing to enable people who couldn't afford to buy houses to buy them. And this was wonderfully defined by an economist who I used to stay with when I was working in Cornwall, who said, and it was somebody else who did this, who said, here's a good idea, let's give money to people who can't afford to pay it back to buy houses they can't afford to live in. Isn't that a great way to send the country forward? And apparently that's partly what happened. But I've spent the afternoon working with a group of fellow trade union members in Equity, the Theatre Workers Union, trying to work out how we can get a sustainable future for the theatre. Now, we stopped George Osborne cutting the budgets 4 years ago.
Yep.
But the question we have to ask is, why are we doing this?
Okay.
And Chris started with how, the Americans start all the time with why, the Europeans in the arts and many other areas start with why. And I think that's the question we have to ask in the future. We've not been asking it. Why don't we ask it? Why don't we ask the question why?
Why don't we ask why? Good. Okay. Let's go, because we've not got an awful lot of time left, but so Chris, let's go across the panel this way. There was one for you at the beginning, which I think was about whether you agreed about the pervasive influence of Econ 101, and then also the point about the...
So on does Economics 101 constrain the art of the political political possibilities? No, I think it would be my simple answer. I think trade-offs do, to be honest, and that is the staple business of public policy, is to say there are lots of things we'd love to do, but we have trade-offs, and they can be either very economic trade-offs in terms of the amount of resources available in the country as a whole, or they can be political trade-offs in the amount of tax that one party or another party might want to raise. I don't believe in that there are very, very easy things that can be done that would transform this country or many other countries into having an entirely different world in which there aren't trade-offs, but if only you did X, everyone would be happy. I don't think we're so far away from, talking about in economics, from a production possibility frontier, that there's something really simple we can do, and everything and everyone gets better off. And just on the
disequilibrium modelling?
On disequilibrium modelling, no, I again think that I think sorry, when I say no, what am I saying no about? I think there's definitely a role in certain circumstances for disequilibrium modelling. There's also a role for models with equilibriums in them, as long as you understand that most of the time you're not going to be at them, and you're going to be thinking about how to get towards them, and how the world works. So you're not having to say, you're not pretending that you are at the equilibrium.
Thank you very much indeed. Oriana, would you like to pick up on this? Is this idea of non-equilibrium economics, does that feature in the field experiments and things that you work on?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the more evidence we collect, the more we realize that almost nothing is in equilibrium, but the idea is to test whether the theories, as Chris says, predict the equilibrium towards which we're walking, because the theory just doesn't say what the equilibrium is, it says how you get there. And so there are predictions on whether that's consistent. Now, the one thing that I'm learning more and more by listening to my fellow panelists and the questions is that economists have a terrible PR machine. What we do doesn't percolate through, and that's clearly, maybe as Chris was saying, a result of the incentive systems that we face. We face the incentive to produce research, but not to translate it, not to teach it necessarily. Now, this is slightly changing. There are websites like Microeconomics Insights that try to translate research in an accessible way, but the incentives are not there. To me, that's the biggest problem that we face.
Fascinating. Maybe that's worth a short piece in itself at some point. Kate, are you coming on
the systems thinking point?
Absolutely, yeah.
I absolutely agree that a smart starting point is to recognise that the economy, like most living systems, most interesting things in the world, are complex adaptive systems. In fact, in my book, the subtitle of my book is 7 Ways to Think Like a 21st Century Economist, and the 4th one is let go of this equilibrium. It was created by William Stanley Jevons and Leon Walras in the 1870s, wanting to make economics as science as reputable as physics, so they based it on the physics of the day, Isaac Newton. They used language like the laws of supply and demand, the laws of diminishing returns, market forces, the market mechanism. You can hear the physics. They were trying to make it look like physics. Let's let go. Almost every other discipline has moved on. and physics even moved on. So start with complex systems. And I often in talks I'm giving, I'll say, the first thing I teach is about feedback. Let's start, there's reinforcing feedback. The more you have, the more you get. Like the more chickens you have, the more eggs you get. The more eggs you have, the more chickens you get. Anything in the world that spirals up, and this isn't hand waving, this is highly informed hand waving. Anything in the world that spirals up or spirals down is dominated by reinforcing feedback. Then there's balancing feedback. The more you have, the less you get back. Our bodies are dominated by balancing feedback, which is, our bodies are so incredible, which is why we are all approximately the same temperature, and we continually adjust and sweat and shiver to keep ourselves there. Now, put those together, add in some delay, add in some other loops, and you can explain most of the interesting systems in the world, from the dynamics of your family relationship, right? There's always someone who winds things up, and then there's somebody who calms things down, to a flock of starlings doing a murmuration in the sky, to the boom and bust of stock markets, to the rise of the 1%, to the collapse of ecosystems. Indeed, when the financial crisis hit, people turned back to Hyman Minsky. If you read Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, it's all written in the language of feedbacks. Now, I've been in debates with economics professors, some of whom said to me, and in no way implying this, I bet Arianna would be the first to teach this because she's cool, but I've been in debates with professors who said, well, systems, I mean, that's just far too advanced to teach to undergraduates, which I just found extraordinarily patronizing. Indeed, this has actually been taught to children in America from kindergarten to year 12. What happens when you start teaching kids to spot the dynamic systems of the living world of which we're a part? They can see it. They start coming up with really interesting analyses. They look for those patterns. I believe every child in the world should be taught to see this. It's just a model, it's just a framework, but it's a damn useful one, to see dynamics. Because if we start looking at dynamics, it's useful not only for economics, it's useful for the living world. And economists, I believe, trained in thinking about dynamic systems and emergent points and tipping points would take the living planet and the jeopardy it's in far more seriously than when it's taught as the language of externality to a market contract.
Thank you very much. And Howard, I wondered if in particular you might like to come back on the final question there, which was partly about, I think, debt addiction and why we always think it's a good idea to borrow more, but also whether there's something in the spirit of the discipline that is about asking how things work rather than maybe why they work as they do.
Well, I think there is some of that going on in the discipline. I mean, the debt addiction point is interesting because we seem to have been conditioned to believe kind of almost private debt good, public debt bad. I mean, that comes back to the influence of Econ 101. But it's actually more to do with the way that certain crude economic concepts like Mrs. Thatcher's handbag economics or whatever filtered their way into the popular discourse. I'm not saying that economics undergraduates are ever taught handbag economics, but there's a very weird kind of straitjacket where the trade-offs, there are trade-offs, but they're framed in a certain way that makes it impossible to break out of a kind of centre or centre-right policy perspective. And I think that is the pervasive influence of neoclassical economics at the end of the day.
Thank you. I think time is... All right, one last comment. We haven't got time to go back to the panel, but...
I think it fits in quite nicely. So I work for a fair trade business.
Yeah.
Try to internalise some of those externalities that other businesses can acceptably externalise. And I definitely see through my career the pervasive impact of this kind of caricature of economics affect policy making, particularly, I would argue, the civil service. So I think elected politicians probably do more of the trade-offs, but the ideological biases, which I've seen amongst the civil servants who probably studied economics in the same generation as me, is quite pervasive in how it affects consumers and society. But my question is, some businesses, mine included, but other businesses and consumers, I believe, are trying to buck the trend.
Yeah.
So how would you all see that economists can learn, actually maybe being a bit behind the curve, can learn from the direction that some forward-thinking businesses are going in and the way forward-thinking consumers are going in to I suppose, what Kate's saying about kind of the feedback loop, to try and make economics more meaningful to how society...
Learning from real-world business. So this good question. We haven't got time to go back to panel, but the good news is that upstairs on the left there will be drinks, and we can continue the discussion or the argument with a drink in our hand if that's what we want to do. I know that some of you are Prospect subscribers, some aren't. We're also trying to drum up, obviously, a bit of interest in that. If anyone wants to try taking out a subscription for just £1 for 3 or 4 issues, then we'll be more than happy to help with that upstairs. But please do thank our panellists, and please do come upstairs and join as many of them who can stick around for a drink. And thanks to all of you for coming.